Yemen is one of the most under-researched and archaeologically rich places on Earth. Located on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, ancient Yemen was home to sophisticated kingdoms that flourished from the trade in frankincense, myrrh, and other spices from around 1200 BC to 525 AD. These kingdoms were well documented through their prolific inscriptions carved in stone. And hidden within Yemen are some of the most extraordinary ancient sites, many of which are relatively unknown. These include the Old Marib Dam, a 600-meter-long ancient engineering masterpiece that sustained an oasis twice the size of New York City. The Awam and Baran temples of Marib, UNESCO World Heritage candidates with towering limestone columns and mysterious carvings. And the ancient city of Timna, with its granite Cyclopean walls that are nearly identical to Peru's Coricancha and other global megalithic sites. Today we'll focus on Timna, a site I believe holds secrets far older than commonly acknowledged. If these sites are new to you, you're not alone. Over this episode and the next, my goal is to change that and to help bring to light some of the most interesting and, I believe, incredibly ancient sites hidden away in Yemen. Timna, also known as Tamna, lies in southwest Yemen at the mouth of a vast desert valley. Its ruins form an oval-shaped mound spanning 65 acres and rising 10 to 15 meters above the surrounding landscape. Attributed to the Qataban Kingdom, which flourished from the 4th century BC to the 2nd century AD, Timna was a key hub on the Incense Route, enriched by the trade of frankincense and myrrh. Pliny the Elder references Timna in his encyclopedic work Natural History, where he says, "Tamna, the capital of the Qatabani, is remarkable for its 65 temples, a number that attests to its wealth and religious devotion. It holds a monopoly on the cinnamon trade and imposes taxes on the incense caravans passing through its territory." Timna was first excavated in the 1950s by the archaeological mission of the American Foundation of the Study of Man, led by Wendell Phillips. Then, in the early 2000s, Italian and French teams completed a more thorough investigation over the course of several years, excavating the city gates, temple complexes, private residences, and an acropolis outside the city walls. Researching these sites was quite a challenge. There's effectively no good, easy-to-access public information written about ancient Timna. What I was able to find involved searching through an obscure Italian archaeological website called Oriental Monuments, which I'll link in the description below. This website houses about 17,000 small photos of the excavations, as well as some of their publications, many of which were written in French or Italian. So with that said, apologies for any grainy images. They are the best available. Okay, let's get started. As I mentioned, this site was first excavated in the 1950s by the American Wendell Phillips. Phillips began his excavations at the South Gate, which was initially almost entirely buried in sand. The South Gate was formed by two flanking towers constructed with massive, roughly hewn granite blocks, some of which were inscribed with ancient texts. The gateway gave access to a large court area where several buildings were unearthed. In a book written in 1952 by American archaeologist and curator at the Smithsonian, Gus Van Beek, he described what they found as follows. The buildings inside the city all exhibited a similar style of masonry and construction, wholly unlike the archaic masonry of the towers of the gateway. This type of masonry consisted of an outer layer of more or less rectangular blocks, laid in regular courses and meeting at the outer edge. In cross-section, however, these blocks are triangular and trapezoidal. The face of the blocks are nicely hammered and had even edges. As you can see from the photos from this excavation, inside the gates are multi-story structures constructed of precise Cyclopean architecture, strikingly similar to the sites in Peru, Egypt, and Japan. My belief is that this is an extremely ancient form of stonework, one that is immediately recognizable once you've researched enough sites. Inside these buildings, the archaeologists found a large quantity of pottery, as well as traces of plaster that preserved the interior walls. I'll read on from Van Beek. At the base of the south wall, 2 bronze statues of Cupids riding lions were found, which originally had been set up facing one another, probably on the roof terrace of the building. These statues show strong late Hellenistic influence and bear identical inscriptions on their bases, providing the first absolute date for this stratum. These bronze lion statues are today housed at the Smithsonian. They were found on a plastered surface outside of a building with Cyclopean masonry. And yes, these are some of the key artifacts being used to date this site to the 4th century BC. Since the 1950s, this portion of the site has been fully reclaimed by the desert and doesn't appear to have been re-excavated by the French and Italian teams in the later campaigns. In the more recent photos from this site, you can see only the front entrance stones that are otherwise completely surrounded by vast amounts of sand. Moving further into the site, the second portion of Timna, excavated by Phillips, was a complex that became known as the Temple of Athirat, a colossal 160 by 140 foot complex enclosed by large granite blocks. It features rows of rooms along the north, west, and south sides, a stepped platform, and 2 lateral stairways. Access is through a large courtyard paved with pink marble slabs. North of this stairway, marble pavement appeared. Van Beek points out that the court, together with the north and south stairways, had been set into what he called an earlier structure. He said that this was made clear by the different masonry styles used throughout the complex. In the 1950s campaign, a 25-foot deep trench was dug along the temple's east face. This revealed an earlier structure beneath. On the screen, I'm displaying his photo, and for scale, you can see a man standing at the top of the wall. This complex is not only large, but clearly it's also extremely deep. Imagine what lies below this structure. Photos show Cyclopean stonework throughout the site, with some blocks appearing to bend around corners, alongside rougher granite and smaller upper stonework. Evidence, I believe, of distinct building periods. As excavations continued, archaeologists unearthed a semicircular well structure. It's an elegant and well-finished fountain built of limestone. If you look at the photos of this well, you can see that it looks quite different from the large granite stones next to it. To my eye, this looks a little out of place, and I suspect it was built in front of this complex at a much later date. The well featured 2 bull-headed drains, which I'll talk about a lot in my next video, and inscriptions found on the fountain have been dated to around the 4th century BC, which is how this entire complex is now being dated. Interestingly, in the French archaeology report from the 1990s, the archaeologists write, "The discovery of the Temple of Athirat is notable because it provides us with a new and unusual plan, which enriches our knowledge of South Arabian temple architecture, showing us the influences that the classical Mediterranean world had in this field." As the archaeologists are noting here, this site looks very different from the more typical temple sites from ancient Yemen. The more famous temples, such as the Awam and Buran temples that I'll be covering in my next episode, have a very specific layout. Constructed primarily of limestone, with clean lines, large courtyards, and monumental pillars. This is the type of architecture you may be familiar with if you've researched any of the ancient sites in Yemen or northern Ethiopia before. But after examining this altogether unique structure at Timna, instead of considering the possibility that its uniqueness stems from its greater antiquity, the archaeologists simply note it as new and unusual and move on. The next site, Timna Temple 1, or TT1, is a 50 by 40 meter rectangular granite complex oriented east-west, divided into Building A to the east and Building B to the west. The main staircase for Building B of this complex is ruined today, but some photographs taken by American archaeologists in the 1950s show the construction. More than 11 meters wide, the first flight reached a paved landing, on which rested a second narrower flight equipped with 3 steps on each side. At the top of the stairs, you enter a vast courtyard surrounded by porticos. The courtyard was carefully covered with stone slabs and sits about a meter lower than the neighboring Building A. The entrance to Building A is a vast platform made up of 8 large megalithic bases which most likely served to support 8 rectangular pillars, which are no longer there today. Similar to the last temple, this structure appears to have had several different building phases. My belief is that the older structure is the lower building B, and the newer portion of this complex is building A, with the bases for the pillars that are much more typical of the newer temple style across Yemen. There were several different types of materials used across this complex. The foundation is made of very large granite blocks. The bases of the pillars were constructed of pink sandstone, and the limestone is used for the paving and the porticos of the courtyard. Building B's walls, which I believe are the oldest, displayed impeccable Cyclopean masonry. In this photo, you can see how perfectly the stones fit together. It even has a smaller rectangular piece included among the much larger stones. If someone were to show me a photo of this wall with no context, I'd guess it was located in Egypt or Peru. Now, in the Van Beek report, he acknowledged the differences in the stone masonry around Timna. Based on the different stonework, he identified 4 construction phases, from the earliest Cyclopean walls to the later repairs, dating them between the 7th and 1st centuries BC. So he doesn't suggest a substantially older origin, but he does at least acknowledge that the differences in stonework could indicate different construction periods and thus different dating. However, French and Italian teams later dismissed these distinctions, attributing stylistic differences to structural roles rather than age. In their report, they stated, "The chronological distinction made by Van Beek between the solidity of the bases of buildings A and B and the careful interior fittings does not seem to be justified. Is the quality of the latter not explained precisely by their position in the building?" In other words, they specifically call him out and argue that the stylistic differences are simply explainable by their location within the building. Presumably, they believe that the larger and higher quality stones are justified as building bases, and you can expect the quality to become lower as you build up. They don't even entertain the idea that certain portions of this structure may date to an earlier time period. So with that, officially the TT1 complex is dated to the 4th century BC, based mostly on the well-known typology of some pottery that was discovered in one of the storerooms in Building B. On to the final site at Timna, the area called the Market Square. The French and Italian teams excavated this site over 5 seasons from 2000 to 2004. They removed an incredible amount of sand and dirt from the site and ultimately recovered 10 structures which were distributed in 2 rows forming a right angle. The largest of these structures, building BH, has a 2-story wall built from massive granite, rough-hewn blocks, the largest of which are raised more than halfway up the structure. Then, most of the remaining structures in the square are constructed with squared granite foundations, similar to the structures that were found at the South Gate. Inside, intersecting walls create symmetrical rooms and naves, with high windowless stone walls. The archaeologists say that the primary function of the stone foundations was to support the upper level of the dwellings, which were composed of 2 or 3 stories of mud bricks and wood. The facades of the upper stories were decorated with geometric motifs, and the roofs had gutters shaped like bulls' heads. Again, I'll discuss the bull motifs in the next episode. During excavations, the team dug quite deeply around these structures, and the highest quality stonework appears to continue into the lowest levels. But during these excavations, they also found the remains of the upper parts of these buildings, which were destroyed by a fire in the 1st to 2nd century AD. Charcoal from the beams of the upper construction were radiocarbon dated to the end of the 4th or beginning of the 3rd century BC. There's also a monolithic granite obelisk in front of these structures called the Market Obelisk. This obelisk was inscribed on all 4 sides with a sloppily written inscription that outlines a set of legal provisions from the 5th to 4th century BC. After several years of excavations, the French and Italian teams concluded. As can be seen, the monuments all belong to the period we call Middle Tamna, approximately 4th century BC to the 1st century AD. This is a brilliant period of Tamna during which the most important and significant buildings were erected, city gates, temples, palaces, and private houses. Today, we can also attribute to this period monuments such as TT1, which in previous excavations by Van Beek were dated to an earlier phase. In practice, everything visible today on the surface of the city belongs to this period. So, what is my theory with this site? I believe that Timna is among Yemen's oldest archaeological sites and may have been originally built by a civilization unrecognized in Yemen's official history. Built on a basement of granite blocks with Cyclopean architecture that is so similar to the other ancient sites we see around the world. Its distinct style, materials, and layout set it apart from other sites in Yemen. The Qataban Kingdom likely settled among these ancient ruins in the 4th to 2nd centuries BC, building atop them and turning these ancient sites into their places of worship, their homes, and their market squares. It's these people that left their inscriptions, pottery, and bronze statues around the site. I find it disappointing that standout sites like these, with such an incredible amount of sophistication and similarities to other ancient sites around the globe, aren't brought to light for the world to appreciate. Instead, they are buried in obscure, difficult to find archaeological reports and dated based on much newer bronze figurines and inscriptions. Sites like these need to be studied more deeply and, more importantly, protected. Which brings me to my final point on the grave threats currently facing these ancient sites in Yemen. Since 2014, Yemen has been embroiled in a devastating multilateral civil war. This terrible conflict has claimed over 150,000 lives, displaced 4.5 million people, and created a humanitarian crisis. It has also severely endangered Yemen's rich archaeological heritage, with approximately 80 ancient sites, museums, and monuments damaged or destroyed just since 2015. The Old Marie Dam, for instance, was hit by airstrikes in 2015. Barakish suffered damage after being used for weapons storage, and looting has fueled a black market trade in artifacts. These losses rob future generations of irreplaceable heritage. I hope for peace in Yemen, both for its people and preservation of its history. Sites like Timna deserve deeper study and protection. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Let me know what you think about this incredible ancient site. I'd appreciate your support by subscribing to my channel and leaving me a review on your favorite platform. You can also follow me on Instagram, X, and Facebook at Secrets in Stone. We'll see you next time.